Welcome to Grant Writing for Schools. This is a series of 6 parts in writing grants for schools. This is part 1, and these are considerations that you need to think about before writing a grant in order to be better prepared to write a successful grant. The disclaimer: funding for this project was provided through a grant from Delta Dental of Arkansas in collaboration with the School-Based Health Alliance of Arkansas and Healthy Act of Arkansas. The information and opinions expressed by the author in this presentation do not necessarily represent the official views of Delta Dental, the School-Based Health Alliance of Arkansas, and Healthy Act of Arkansas. So, what's your motivation for writing a grant? Here are some questions that you need to talk and ask yourself for you and your team members if you're getting ready to start writing a grant. If you can answer these questions with some good, clear answers, then you should be in a pretty good position to write a grant that you're seeking. If you don't have clear answers for some of these questions, I suggest you go find some answers to these questions before you begin the process. But these are some questions that you really should ask yourself before even beginning the process of, are we ready to write this grant? Why are you writing for the grant? What's your purpose behind writing for the grant? If you have a purpose, then there's your direction right there. Do you qualify for writing for these grant funds? Some grants are very specific in terms of what they will fund. And if you're writing for a grant and what the intent of the grant funds are for don't match, likelihood of you getting that grant will probably not happen. Do your needs meet the requirement of the grant requirements? As I said before, grants are out there to serve purposes, and if your purpose does not meet those requirements, funding's probably not going to happen. So find grants out there that you can write to meet the needs of what you want to do in your agency or your district. How do you know what your needs are? Do you have any kind of data documentation or a needs assessment? Or is it just something, well, we need to do something? Because you know you have a problem, go find some data to support that. There's going to be some data out there. Who's your target audience? Who are you trying to meet the needs of? That has to be clearly identified, and find some data that'll support that. Again, talked about the data. There's data out there that can support your needs if you find it in the right place. If there's not any data out there, then do a little needs assessment that'll support your needs. Who will benefit from these grant funds? Talk about why you need these grant funds. There's obviously a purpose behind it. So who's going to benefit from these, and how will you know that you've met the needs? How are you going to be able to measure the success? Just because you've got the grant funds, you also need to make sure up front you set up yourself that you can measure your success in meeting those needs. Most important thing when you're writing a grant, read the application clearly and read the whole thing. Take a highlighter, take a red pen, take something, highlight things that stick out to you, circle things, make notes on it, write questions. Read through the entire thing before you decide that you can write for the grant. I do not recommend splitting up the grant sections and having different people read it and sharing it. Sometimes that's a good way to interact, but have everyone, if you're having other people help you with it, have them read the entire application. Do not section it out. Do not have people write sections of the grant without working together on it, because that has a tendency to have some discontinuity among the grant application, and that can be pretty evident when the grant reviewers start reading this. Key points to look for when you're looking at a grant, whether to decide if you're going to write for it or not. Are you eligible to write for this grant? Some grant people require you to be a nonprofit or a 501c3 organization. Some will require that it's only for state or local education or governmental agencies. Some require specific target populations. So make sure you're clear on who's eligible to write for the grant. How much is available to write for in the grant? The other question to that is, can you write for that amount of grant, money in the grant? Can you spend that amount of money on what you need? Some people who get a grant, sometimes they end up not being able to spend all that money, and that doesn't reflect real well on the grantors. So can you spend that money on what you need to spend it on for your target audience? Be real clear on where your money's going. Know the requirements and restrictions of the grant. You know what the money can be spent on and what it cannot be spent on. Sometimes bigger federal grants, they have a lot of restrictions on what your money can be spent for. A lot of them will not pay for things like food, for meetings, workshops, trainings. You had to just be real clear on what your grant funds can and cannot be spent on. Grants also, most of the time, cannot be spent on items that will supplant requirements in a state. So if the law says the state has to provide CPR and it's mandated, a lot of grants will not be able to provide for CPR mannequins or anything like that because it's a state mandate, so that the state has to, the schools will have to take care of that. So grants cannot go towards certain things like that. So be understanding of what the requirements of the grants are and what you can and cannot do with those grant funds. Scoring criteria. Some of the bigger grants, federal grants out there will provide a scoring criteria or a rubric. And if that's the case, you want to make sure you're very familiar with that scoring rubric, because that right there will tell you exactly how your grant application will be scored. And you should use that rubric as your roadmap for writing your grant and make sure that you've got all of your points in your grant met in that rubric. That should be your guide to writing your grant. When you write a grant, you are at the mercy of the grant reviewers. Grant reviewers have vast different experiences. They have different biases. They have different criticisms. Some are very hard. Some are very easy. You are at the mercy of whoever's reading your grant for you. It's difficult because you can write a really good grant, and if for whatever reason a grant reviewer doesn't like it, it's probably not going to get funded. So try not to get too discouraged if that's the case. But it can be kind of tricky sometimes. Reviewers are looking for reasons not to fund a grant. Now, this really means that if you're going to make mistakes when you write your grant, you're going to make it easy for the reviewers to get those out of the way. If they have enough money to fund 25 grants and they have 50 or more grants, they're going to look for any way to throw something out of the mix so they don't have to read it, because that's going to be a lot of work for them. So here's a list of some things that you really need to be checking on, because this is what reviewers will dump you in a second. Spelling errors. I know we all rely on spell check and everything else like that, but you really need to have 2 or 3 other sets of eyes read your work or the group's work and check for spelling errors. Between that and punctuation, that will get it tossed out. Not following the directions in the grant application. This will get it kicked out really easy. You followed the directions for that grant. Doesn't matter if it makes any sense or not, you do it the way they ask you to do it, and you'll be fine. If you don't follow the directions, they'll dump it out. Missing pieces to the application. Somebody's going to go through and look and make sure you've got all the pieces that's required in that application. And if there's a piece missing, they'll dump it. They won't even look and read it. They'll dump it. So make sure you have those pieces and make sure they're in order. If they're out of order, that's not going to play well with the reviewers, because they don't like trying to find the sections in the application. So if they're out of order, they'll throw them out. When they first get grants, a lot of times whoever's going through in the first round, they'll look and make sure your budget matches with that work plan. Because your work plan talks about what you're going to be doing with your grant funds. So everything in your work plan has to be reflected in your budget. If it's not reflected in your budget doesn't reflect in your work plan, there's a miscommunication of that, and they'll throw it out. So make sure your budget represents your work plan. Budget errors, use a calculator, have somebody else do the work, double check your figures, have your budget checked closely, because a lot of budget errors will also turn off the grant reviewers. Too wordy, saying nothing. I've read a lot of grants where some people think it's impressive to be really wordy and all these flowery, important words, and that's not going to cut it. Just be clear, be concise, say what you need to say, show what you need to show, and don't add a lot of stuff to it. Too many pages are over the limit. Some of the requirements that goes to not following the directions, sometimes they'll put you page limits on each section. You can have 2 pages for the introduction, and you can have 10 pages for your work plan. If you go over those pages, they can throw it out. Sometimes following the directions also means you have to have certain size font. You have to have certain size margins. If you manipulate the font size or the margin size to fit your information within the page content, both catch that too. So be careful, follow the directions, don't go over your pages, because they may read it, but they won't go over that last page. So they're going to be missing some information. So stay within your page limit. Not having the required signatures. Some of them will require a program manager signature. Most of them will require a budget financial person signature. All of them will require an administrative signature. Missing any or all of the signatures will not get funded. Federal documents. This would include a W-9 form or a federal tax ID number. All school districts have federal tax ID numbers because they also get federal money. So it's the same thing as kind of a W-9 or a Social Security number. Missing federal documents will also throw you out. For grant reviewers, it's easy to throw them out. Believe it or not, grant reviewers do want to read good grant applications because they want people to be successful with their grant funds. So really putting your grant together in a good, organized way that they want to see it is really important. Getting started. Begin with the end in mind. What is it that you want to accomplish with these grants? What is it that you need to accomplish with these grants? And can you do it? And what you're talking about be done, is it reasonable to write for? And what you're asking to do, can it be done within the time period that you're required? Do you have the infrastructure in place to start on this? Because if you have to establish some infrastructure after you get your grant funds, that's going to take up more time. Do you have your people in place? Do you have your partners in place up front? Grant reviewers like to see that you've got all your people in place, all your partners in place, how your partners are going to support you and how you're going to work with your partners. Begin with the end in mind and then work backwards. Who needs to be at the table? Like I said, partners, colleagues. Who do you need to have at the table that's not at the table? Show how you're working with your partners in your grant. Get some letters of support from your partners. And the letters of support should not be generic. Have those letters of support from your partners be specific in what they're going to do to support you and your efforts. Any other colleagues that need to be at the table that can help. Identify missing pieces. Who's missing? What's missing? What else do we need? Try and have all your bases covered. Again, what do you want to do? What do you want to accomplish? It's important because you want to write a grant to address it, so it is important. So what is it specifically that you want to do? What are your needs? Okay, think about this again. What are your needs? How do you know what your needs are? What are you seeing? What are you experiencing? What data do you have to support this? Where can you find more data? Have you done a needs assessment? Who's your target population? Who needs to be involved? Who can help you with this? Do your homework. Research who's providing the grant funds. Know what their mission and their vision is. Does what you want accomplished support the mission and the vision of whoever's providing the grant funds? So sometimes it helps to intermingle your mission with their mission, and they'll know that you're understanding of what they're trying to do as well. So these are some tips that will help you get prepared for writing a good grant application.